is. You flip it up. Yep. It's like 2 clicks. Good morning. Welcome to Living Well Church here in Dixon, Illinois. Top of the morning to you. Yeah, good morning. Yep, this is our home base, hometown of Ronald Reagan. Yep. Yep, good morning. God bless you. We're so glad you're able to join us. Let's learn together today. Today, the topic is the saving work of the suffering servant. So it says, God's servant suffered to provide for our salvation. We will start in Isaiah chapter 52. We'll start in there, Isaiah 52 at verse 13. All right, let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get into our lesson today. Holy Father, just once again, we give you praise, and honor, and glory, and thanks for being you, for being holy, for being almighty and righteous, for being everything that you inherently are. We just thank you so much for you, Lord, the mighty Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Please help us today as we look into your word. We're looking at your the work of your only begotten Son, your plan of salvation. So help us to learn from what Jesus did, something that we can apply. The application is paramount. It's important, Lord. So help us with that, to apply it and become more like your suffering servant, your Son. So we thank you for everything you're doing in us, for us, and through us. Please minister to us now in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, the good Lord was gracious to us already. We had a mighty cold front come through up here in the northern Illinois, and it pushed all that snow and everything to the south. So if you like the cold or would rather have cold over, not like cold, but would rather have the cold over the snow, you can thank the Lord for that. That cold front came down. So now we're all bundled up. If you have a loved one, you're inside with your loved one, and we're going to talk about that today, your loved ones. First question is, what is your love language? If you don't know what that means, it refers to the way in which you express love, and thus in the way that you want to receive it from other people, your love language. For some, it's words of love, affirmation, quality time, acts of service, or physical touch. So it can be affirmation, words, it can be spending the time together, it can be a certain just holding hands, the way that you show it. There are different ways to show love, and each one of us are wired in a certain way to appreciate one over the other, if that makes sense. It says one that resonates with this person is the giving of gifts. And not only does this person like to give good gifts, but they treasure the gifts that those have been planned and carried out and given. So it can be gift giving too. Over the course of your life, have you been given any particular gift that stands out to you? What makes that gift stand out to you? If you guys, can you think over your life of a gift that somebody gave you? What stood out about that gift in particular that stands out to you? What are your thoughts on that? Was it the time spent that somebody took to pick it out? Was it the money that was spent on it that you appreciate? Their hard work, earning that money, and they went and purchased it for you? What was it about that gift that stands out to you?
I think attentiveness to where I was in life at the time. It meant a lot. Just being aware of my needs.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought too, a way to put that. At Christmas time, we all get different gifts, and a lot of times, if you're an adult, people will ask you, well, what do you want? Well, I don't really want anything. If I need it, I go get it. So I don't really have any wants. So sometimes it's hard to buy for each other, adults, spouses. And if you do have a spouse and children, what you do invariably, just as a side note, is you will find out what your spouse wants or needs, but the kids are asking you, what does mom want? So you relay that to them. So on Christmas morning, they open it up and they're like, oh, you shouldn't have. And you're like, well, I got you some toothpaste. You didn't know what to get because all the good stuff, so that can be tough. But as our brother said, to know someone well enough without even asking them to know what they need, that's an important point for today, an important takeaway. To know you well enough, God does that. He knows you well enough without you even asking. He knows what you need, and He will step up to the plate. He loves to give to you, to provide. So in today's session, we discover the surprising way that God's gift of salvation has come to this world. So our first reading is Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15. If I have a volunteer.
See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond any human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand.
Isn't that interesting? How about that first sentence? My servant will act wisely. He will be raised up and lifted up and highly exalted. Jesus, at one point when he was talking, said that he will be lifted up, just like the serpent was in the desert, just like Moses did in the desert. Do you guys recall that story of where the snakes came into the camp and they bit the Israelites? It was a form of punishment because they'd been acting disobediently, as they just all the time seem to do, come around in that cycle. But God instructed, first Moses interceded for them. Lord, please, spare us, spare your people. We know we're a stiff-necked people, but please, spare us. And God saw their need again, and he had Moses raise up a serpent on a big staff. Do you guys recall that story at all? And if the people looked at it, what happened? They looked upon it. Yep, they were spared. Even though they were bitten, they were spared. Here it says Jesus will be raised up, lifted up. He was raised up and lifted up on that cross. He's highly exalted, and if we will look upon him, follow him, we will be spared. You can see a lot of the foreshadowing. Yeah, and it is. It's still used in the medical field today, that snake. Not Sneaky Snake. That's a song, and he's a different snake. But yeah, that snake is still used, as our brother said, in the medical field today. So our passage begins with God speaking about the servant and the servant's impact upon the nations. Now, it's important that we remember that Isaiah was written in a particular context, one in which many Israelites had been forced into Babylonian exile. So to a people in exile, how do you think this message was received? That his servant will be raised up and lifted up, highly exhausted. Exhausted? Exalted. That's me, exhausted. That even kings will shut their mouths because of him. Do you think that was encouraging at all to them in exile? Yeah, I bet. They were clinging to anything they could find that was good news. just clinging to it. And of course, in verse 14, it asks how God describes the servant. His appearance was so disfigured and his form marred beyond any human likeness. He was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed. So how did the many react when seeing this servant? And why do you think they reacted this way? Yeah, what do you think? How did the many react when seeing the servant? And why do you think they reacted this way? Yep. Disfigured and marred. So at the onset, it looks pretty bleak, does it not? But what they didn't understand, they'll now see. None of the disciples could understand when Jesus kept saying, I'm going to go coming to my end. You're going to be here without me. They knew in a way what he was talking about. I mean, they weren't unintelligent, but they totally didn't get the salvation picture. But now, now it says, for what they were not told, they will see. They're going to understand why he was crushed. What they have not heard, they will understand. The exaltation of Jesus will be even greater than the punishment. It says in Hebrews 2, he scorned the shame of the cross. What does that mean to you? That's an interesting verse, isn't it? That he went willingly to his death. He scorned the shame of the cross. It was shameful to be crucified, was it not? Stripped down, nailed up there, in front of everybody, as my teachers used to say, God and country, in front of everyone. But he scorned it because he knew what he was doing. Even though he was having all that done, he knew what he was doing. He scorned the shame of it. It wasn't shameful to him. He did it for us. Dare I say, once he got his mind set in the Garden of Gethsemane, once he got his mind set, he actually looked forward to it, completing the Father's will, not your will, but mine. He started with the closed fists, and we've said the closed fists usually are used for striking. They're not used for positive things. But after he was in the garden with the closed fists, he opened his hands. Open hands help. They heal. They carry. He did that for us. He healed us and carried us with those open hands, took the nails, as they say. So he scorned the shame of the cross. To him, it wasn't shameful. Our next reading is Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9, if I have a volunteer. 1 through 9.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
Thank you. It says, in reference to the servant, he is described as a tender shoot and a root out of dry ground. What do these images bring up? What do they evoke? He is a tender shoot and a root out of dry ground. If you think about that, especially you who are green thumbers, plant people, that's not me. Yeah. I tried. But what does that evoke? What does that bring up out of you? To hear the servant, Jesus, described as a tender shoot, and then as a root, or a root, some people say, a root out of dry ground. What do you think about that?
Well, by the time Jesus had arrived, Judaism had become pretty systematized, it appears, and maybe potentially dry to some who were practicing the rituals. And Jesus has connection to that, but in comparison, he is new. He is the new wine, like we talked about last week. He is the new life. And, you know, going back to what your first section there, you know, it was very difficult for the Jews to rectify in their minds, I think, the image of the victorious Messiah coming. How could he be the Messiah, having looked so humiliated in their eyes? How could that have? How could he be the Messiah? I mean, that's not what we were thinking at all. And yet, boy, if they knew, I mean, if they could just see what we see now, you know, reading here in Isaiah, it just, you know, the prophet describes Christ so perfectly as to who the Messiah would be and what would happen, which tells us, you know, we need to be careful not to be blinded by our own expectations and be open to, you know, the Spirit's leading, which is, you know, we lean heavy into history and context and precedent, and because we're fearful that we'll get off, you know, off track. You know, we don't want that. So from that respect, you know, there's rootedness, but we have to be open to the Spirit's leading, and that's it. It seems risky, you know. But to be led by the Spirit is so different than to be led by the law. You know, there's rootedness in the law, the principles, the values are there. But the Spirit, I mean, in Christ, he was doing things that, I mean, associating with prostitutes and tax collectors and allowing himself to be touched and, you know, who is this? You know, and we just watched Jesus of Nazareth again, which is my favorite depiction of the life of Christ on video. And I think they captured it well. I mean, they were just abhorred at a rabbi doing the things he was doing. And, you know, that partially led to, I mean, although it was in God's big plan, their expectations of who the Messiah would be were so radically different than who he was.
To me, it's an interesting contradiction, the way that I view it. You know, when I think of a tender shoot, you know, you think of this nice little green thing coming up out of very soft, fertile soil, very fragile. You know, explain it that way, and then this root coming out of dry ground, something big and bulky and strong, you know, and to see those two things collide, it just seems like a contradiction to me. So I find it like to be a really cool analogy.
Yeah, because that tender shoot, that fragile part of it, when you first hear of Jesus with your hardened heart and tradition in your life, whether you're, as we said about the Jews and the Pharisees with their traditions, or you're just a man or woman of the world and have your own set of traditions, that is a tender shoot when you first hear the message of Jesus. It's very fragile. And the Spirit works on people, has to take that stony heart, and it has to take that shoot out of the dry ground. But Jesus is the living water. He has his own water. He can exist, come out of dry areas, dry ground. And as it said, make dry bones come to life. So you're right, it is a kind of a contradiction, and it's weird to hear it. It's pretty cool how they write a lot of this stuff. And I do like what you said, too, about the Pharisees having a preconceived notion, but that blinded them. And we have done remember the brown and green test in here? I've done that many times to show you how your focus, if you're looking around at everything brown and they say, count them all up, it's going to be a quiz. And then you tell them to close their eyes. You say, tell me everything that was green. They gasp because you just asked them about brown. So they literally deleted all the green stuff. So they were having a hard time with this message, again, because of tradition and things. But as our brother said, it is a tender, fragile thing coming out. But also, as our brother said, Tony said, it is a root out of dry ground. There is some strength there, some stout strength to come out of dry ground and to exist and keep moving regardless of the other. And as you said, he communed with sinners. He sat and ate with them. He allowed them to touch him, and things that were absolutely abhorrent to the others because of the pedestal thing. They'd been put on a pedestal. And Jesus, much like my studies, show that you need to be right in there as a leader in church. You need to be right in there. Your presence, even just your presence, is important. You cannot lead by proxy, especially for an extended period of time. It can be accepted for a little bit, but to lead by proxy is kind of just almost like, they call it like a rancher, where you're leading the herd as a whole from a distance. You need to be more of a shepherd right in there with each individual one, carrying this lamb, helping that one or cattle if you're using the rancher thing. But yeah, it says in verses 2 and 3, the servant was described as undesirable, unattractive, despised. A lot of the things we were talking about and John was talking about, they just didn't understand him. He was rejected. He was regarded poorly. And of course, they at every opportunity, they tried to cause him to suffer, even to the point of suffering on the cross. So this tells us that this servant, because it asks, what does this tell us about the servant? He endured all of this. He still got his job done. As I was talking about my work week being rough and tough, and I could complain, but God gave me everything I needed to get through it, to accomplish it. The same thing with this servant. Even with all of this going on, he said those three important words, "It is finished." He accomplished the job. God will give you everything you need. It says the group, these words are speaking to us at the time in these verses, appears to be changing the way they view the servant. So after his death and resurrection, this seems like they changed the way they viewed the servant, the one who took their pain and bore their suffering. Of course, they benefited from the servant's actions. It asks what was the result. Healing took place. Peace came to them and restoration. In verse 6, what is the community coming to terms with? Why is this recognition important to their future in verse 6? It's just off the screen. In verse 6, what is the community coming to terms with? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, like sheep, we've all gone astray. My goodness gracious. And we've all heard the stories of sheep, how they will just wander right into trouble, right into thickets. They'll fall into holes. They'll do all kinds of things. Sheep. And we, like sheep, have gone astray. So he asks, why do you think Isaiah, or what do you think he meant when he said that the servant took up our pain and bore our suffering? What do you think that means, that he took up our pain and bore or carried our suffering? How would you explain that to somebody if they didn't know Jesus? Be a good question, too. What do you think he meant when he said that the servant, which we know is Jesus, we have the Paul Harvey, we can look back and see the rest of the story. What does that mean, that he took up our pain and bore our suffering? What do you think?
We didn't have to do it.
Yeah,
We didn't do it. He did it.
we didn't do it.
He came to where we were and lifted us up, experienced hardship because of us, and took it upon himself to get us out.
Absolutely. Yeah, when that sheep wandered off and was injured, fell in a hole, attacked by wolves, or he felt every bit of that. He took all of that pain. He took everything upon himself, if that makes sense. He bore all of our pain and suffering and released us from it. Just real quick, this year, I would ask that you not carry any grudge into 2025 that you have with anyone, that you would find it in your heart to forgive them. Now, I know this is kind of taking a sidestep, But again, Jesus bore all of that. It's already been taken care of. Now, I understand, and I've had a big discussion with this in the men's group on Monday. The ones that felt the most wronged and could not give it up had such a hard time, and they even said that. I cannot see myself ever giving that up. Involved their kids, or somebody had wronged their kids. And I'm not making light of it. I'm not belittling it. It's very real, especially when you love your children so much and you're protecting. How dare someone do something? But did we not do something to God's kid? To God's son? And we have been forgiven. How can we hold that against someone? It doesn't mean that it was right. You're never giving permission to do such a thing. You're not saying it was right. But what you're not doing is holding on to it in here anymore. So anyone listening, anyone around, if there's a grudge, especially against a Christian brother or sister, but in general, if there's a grudge, even if it involves someone with a loved one, let it go. The pain and anguish, the negative, the hardness, let it go. And people will say, yeah, but. There's no yeah, but. Jesus didn't do that on the cross. He says, I'll take everybody's stuff but that guy's. He took all of it. So let it go. 2025, don't bring anything in. Forgive across the board, however that looks. Now, does that mean you might try to pick it up at another point? Yes, you might. Yeah, 2026. Yeah, just let it go. You have something, brother? Oh, I saw you moving. That's just kind of a message that's with me this morning, and it's a personal thing that I'm doing. I had been wronged not too long ago by a Christian brother, and one of my kids was present, and I went right away into, what do you call it, de-escalation mode and everything, and got it taken care of, but I had a hard time with that because one of my kids was present. And it just angered me to even think about it. But then I got to thinking, how can I hold that against this Christian brother? Doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean I'm signing back up for more of it. But I mistreated God's son. I caused his death. And God didn't hold that against me. He sent his son to die for me. So, again, even if it involves, that's usually the toughest one. Because if they do it to you personally, you can usually say, okay, I'll let it go. But if it involves a loved one, so my message this morning is to let it go. Across the board, just let it go. Okay, our last reading is Isaiah 53, verses 10 through 12, and we'll come in for a landing.
Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offering and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils among the strong. Because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered by his numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
So it says, when you consider the status of the servant at the beginning of our text, how has that changed towards the end? At the beginning, he was pierced and crushed. Couldn't recognize him. Now it says, after he has suffered, what? He will see the light of life and be satisfied. Yep. I've read, the scholars talk about it. Jesus did not raise himself up, even though he was completely capable of being of the Trinity. But even the resurrection, the rising, he waited for the Father to say, "Arise, my son." He did everything so perfectly. But he could have walked out of there himself. But he waited in death in the grave and waited for his Father to say, "Arise." I think there's even a song about that. "Arise, my love," or "Arise." So in what ways does it make a difference that Isaiah wrote about the suffering servant 700 years before Jesus was born? Does that make a difference that Isaiah wrote about Jesus 700 years before this? What does that kind of show about God? 700 years. God is alive and well, is he not? He's bigger than time. His plans do not change. When he has an idea of something, it's going to get done. So if he's called you to something, get on board. Who do you think's going to win? As you kick against the goads and wrestle and struggle. If he's calling you to do something, even with that forgiveness that I talked about earlier, if the Spirit puts the holy thumb on your back and says, go up to that person and say, "I held a grudge. I'm sorry." That's all you have to do. However they handle that is up to them. But whatever God's going to have you do, do it. Now, we began this session talking about gifts. And we have received much that we didn't deserve: salvation, righteousness, life. So as the Apostle Paul would later say that the manner in which God works is a stumbling block to the world. Some people stumble upon it. So it says, as we close today, give God thanks for the gift of salvation. Help others who are stumbling on it. And your assignment this week is such. It says, if the way of God looks like pouring out one's life for the sake of others, what does that mean for you as you go about your life this week? How can you pour out your life for the sake of others? How can you sacrifice this week and help someone else? Life gets messy, does it not? When Jesus told a parable about a man who was beaten and was laying by the side of the road, the very first one that comes up is a priest. Do you remember that in that parable? The very first one is a priest. Comes up and says, "I'll pray for you," and leaves. Life is messy. He didn't want to get messy. He had something to do. He was going to the church. So yes, it's good that you come to church. It's good that you do things. But get a little messy. Help people this week. So that's all I have. I don't want to beat on that too much. It gets a little messy. Don't just... And, of course, it's according to your resources and what you have. But yeah, get in there a little bit this week. Any other thoughts or comments? We'll close real quick. I see people are going to be coming in. Father God, thank you once again for this message. Please help us to apply what needs to be applied. Holy Spirit, please go through each one of us individually. You love us so much. Please point out what we need to change and then apply it. Please bless us as we continue with worship today. Bless your servant John Trotter as he brings the message. Thank you for all you are doing and your love for us. And we ask and pray and say all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.